Come wind, rain or shine, there's still one man on top seemingly. Let's get started.
Another race for the world's greatest driver, Juan Manuel Fangio.
Former world champion Jim Clark leapt into the lead. That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb.
And James Hunt is the world champion by just one single point.
By being a racing driver, you are under risks all the time. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver.
And that is Michael Schumacher ahead, the world champion.
To become a four-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton, champion of the world.
That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible.
Max Verstappen is champion of the world.
Oh my God! Max Verstappen, you are the world champion! The world champion!
Hello and welcome to episode 26 of F1 in Review 2023. I'm Tom Clabon and I'm joined by Angus, Gallager and Tristan Fancourt. Today we look back at the return of F1, the Dutch Grand Prix, and we start off with one man from that very country, Max Verstappen, where you've guessed it, he's won again, this being his 11th win this season and his 9th win in a row, meaning he's equalled the all-time record first set by Sebastian Vettel in a Red Bull, funnily enough, back in 2013. Now, Tristan, what significance do you place on this achievement or achievements like it? We know Verstappen's a very good driver, but what does this tell us about him and other things, really?
I think it tells us that Red Bull is very good at winning 9 races in a row, and or picking drivers that can do it, certainly. And that's pretty crazy, isn't it, when you think about what it takes to win 9 in a row. And I don't know about you, but at the end of lap 70, I was sitting there thinking, I can't believe once again we're going to see Max win. Not necessarily because Max doesn't deserve to win, just because there were so many factors that went into this race. So many things happening all at once. And yet he just sort of comes out at the other end. It's like he's made of Teflon this season and nothing can stick to him. And not only that, but the best challenge at the whole race, best challenge came from the unexpected Liam Lawson, apparently, who managed to overtake him very temporarily. And, well, I say overtake him. Unlapped himself, but technically that means overtaking before Max came past, which, again, is bizarre. The twists and turns. Yeah, not even Fernando Alonso could get past Max Verstappen this weekend, and yet, and out of nowhere, AlphaTauri did. But, as I say, through all of that, through the rain, the sunshine, the massive blaring music, because there was a party going on in the grandstands, Max Verstappen has won. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about him at the moment, which is he seems to just be completely untouchable. He was taking multiple seconds out of Sergio Perez's time when Sergio Perez was briefly in the lead of the race. He was taking 2.something seconds, 2.3, 2.4 seconds out of Sergio Perez's time per lap. He was a second faster than anyone else in qualifying. The only chance we had this weekend of Max not winning was the weather, and even then he seemed to just manage to manipulate his race into set of circumstances where he came on top. So I think what I can say at the moment is Max seems untouchable, and going into Monza, I have a funny feeling we're going to see that 9 race record broken.
I can't lie, I've been particularly impressed by how Verstappen just perfects everything, and it's not even just the obvious things like being the most optimum race car or even managing to keep the car on the track. Every time I see him, he makes a perfect start. So it'd be so easy under the pressure that he's under, especially in front of his home fans, to drop the clutch and then not get away strongly, and all of a sudden Norris is leading into turn 1, you've got a different race. Or for that pressure, for the expectation from that orange army to sort of just weigh upon him. I mean, you've seen cases in the past in Formula 1 where drivers can be absolutely mighty on the track, but when it comes to their home race, some of them just crumble under the pressure, or they just don't cope as well. Or they don't perform in their home race. Think of Charles Leclerc. His record in his home race is awful. I mean, I'm not exactly, it's not like the Monaco streets are lined with roaring fans like Zandvoort is, but there's still the pressure of performing in your home race. Verstappen just doesn't seem to care. He just plucks that emotion out and just puts it to one side, and he's able to produce the goods and get a great result. And like you said, everything was thrown at him. Absolutely everything. Weather, tyre changes, strategy, then it dried up, then some more weather. But he was just, even little things like when it absolutely started chucking it down with rain on about lap 60, and he went past the pit lane, and he said on the radio, "Oh no, it's fine, I'll just keep going for a bit longer." And his engineer responded with, "Now would be a very good time to pit." Of which he was a very fair call when it was absolutely biblical showers, and it went very quickly from dries to full wets. He just seems so in control. It's absolutely ridiculous. I saw some stat which admittedly has its caveats, but in the last 60 races where Verstappen has not had a car problem of some kind, where the car's been healthy, he's won 41 of them, and he's come second in 14. So in about 90% of the last 3 years where his car has been healthy, he's finished in the top 2. His consistency is absolutely ridiculous, and it's crazy to think that a driver who a few years back we were saying, "Oh, he's got a bit of an immature streak, he's either hero or zero," and he's now matched what I think is possibly the hardest record to match in Formula 1 history, winning 9 races in a row. Even if you're in the most dominant car ever, winning 9 races in a row is astonishing. And there was one of the Sky reporters joked with Christian Horner that by the end of the year it could be 18 in a row because there's 9 races left, and he looks unstoppable. It can't be, surely. Statistically, something's via Sod's law, something's going to happen.
We keep on saying this.
Well,
we
no.
do.
We keep saying this. Oh, surely
But the
not.
more we keep on saying it, the higher the chances that something will happen, because statistically, it will. And I know it seems like it wouldn't in a race where we had ridiculous changes of weather and strategy, and where he actually had to overtake people. He had to overtake 3 cars. Okay, he went down to fourth. He went down to fourth, and he had to overtake an Alpine, an Alfa Romeo, and his teammate, which is such a hard life. I know. Yeah, crazy record, really, all things considered. Yeah, you run out of words to describe the guy.
It does remind me very much of Sebastian Vettel's 2013 season, as I can remember it, insofar as I think he's now at the peak of his powers, the purple patch of his career so far. But there's a question mark, really, and I suppose we'll only be able to find this out in years to come, whether this is going to be the ultimate peak and a short-term peak for Verstappen, or whether this is a continued period of dominance that, let's say, Hamilton's had before, Schumacher's had before, and many other F1 races before that as well. But I do think that despite him doing so well, I think this is slightly easier, if I may say, than Sebastian Vettel doing it, because while Vettel had a goal for class in terms of car to the other, you did also have Mark Webber as his teammate, a teammate who was, in my eyes, better than Perez and someone who's more close to him in terms of quality. So let's not take anything away from Verstappen's incredible record here in terms of those 9 races, but I think it's fair to say he's certainly been helped by circumstances. But that being said, I think he will beat this record, take it to 10 at Monza, but that may be the commentator's curse, because if we keep on saying it, then surely someone else must win, he says hopefully.
Do you think he's going to win in Monza, knowing what we know about the track and the high speed, or do you think do you think there's a track that Red Bull is vulnerable at this season, or are they just not? If
I were to be positive for anybody who's not Red Bull, I'd look back at that incident between Verstappen and Hamilton and see how, yes, that was 1 or 2 years ago, but he's still perhaps a bit reckless, a bit naive at times against the right driver in the right circumstances when the pressure is on. And granted, he's no longer in a title fight, so that takes the tension out of it, so to speak. But he's not got an amazing record at Monza. If it were, let's say, 9 wins in a row going into Zandvoort per se, then I go, well, that's done, isn't it? It's sorted, it's over, fair enough, because he's won there every single time he's raced there. But at Monza, a bit more of a patchy record, and I think also Mercedes will have a point to prove after this disastrous weekend. Ferrari likewise as well on their home turf after a fairly lukewarm season. So I think it'll be tougher for Verstappen, but not necessarily as tough as it has been.
Will he win? Yeah, he will. I'm trying to find reasons for him not to win, and I looked down the list, and there have been 2 non-Red Bull pole positions so far this season. I'm not counting Spa, where Verstappen got pole but then had the gearbox penalty. So it's just Azerbaijan and Hungary, both of which are very different tracks, interestingly. But will Red Bull win in Monza? Of course they will. I reckon Red Bull just win every race for the rest of this century. To be honest, it's just
you finally admitted to it. Finally,
hyperbole.
Yeah, the Mercedes fan in him is crumbling.
No, maybe. I mean, Williams could win at Monza. You never know. I mean, we saw on a circuit just gone where they were supposed to be one of the weakest cars and have a package which couldn't compete at all. They've got both cars in the top 10, so maybe Alex Albon will win in Italy. Who knows?
Oh yeah.
I mean that is a possibility. And actually, I disagree with your statement that they were considered weak for this race, because Williams' whole thing is this absolute flying top speed. So Monza is their best chance, and this is part of the reason why Logan Sargent was devastated in the race when he crashed out, was because this is Williams' track, one of the few tracks where they could really, really claw some points. And for him to bin it, and it wasn't actually his fault, I'm going to say that, but it wasn't his fault. He hit the curb, and then James Vowles can confirm this, that the power steering broke on his car, so he had no steering, and that's why it was such a weird crash. He basically then just went into the barrier. He couldn't steer. But the problem is because the car ended up destroyed, it crippled his chances of getting any serious points, and that's why I think he was so upset. But Monza is another one of these fast tracks. I mean, I think I'm right in saying it is the fastest track on in the calendar. It used to be, at the very least. Maybe Saudi Arabia is technically faster now. You'll check me on that. But it's one of the opportunities. But I still don't think that Williams can challenge Red Bull, even with the speed. I think the overall package, unfortunately, means that Max Verstappen's going to win. So, how many races in a row is Max Verstappen going to win before that particular streak gets broken? And we can go into next year if you'd like. We won't allow testing. We won't allow testing because people sandbag on testing. But he's at 9 now. There's 9 more races to the end of the season, so he can get to 18 this season. How many races will Max Verstappen extend the streak to, the record to?
His streak will end in the first US Grand Prix, because historically other cars that aren't Red Bull have done well there and made the biggest upgrades there, so that would make it 13 going on 14?
It's got to end at some point, like I said, but I just don't know what that point is. I'm trying to look down the list and see. He'll win at Monza. Singapore he was rubbish at last year, so he's got a point to prove. Suzuka, Red Bull go well there. Qatar, did he win in Qatar last time, or was it Hamilton? I can't remember. A couple of years ago now. Probably win in Austin. He always wins in Mexico. Brazil, Red Bull are pretty good there now. He'll win there. Should we say Las Vegas? I reckon Las Vegas. That could be it's a bit of an anomaly. Could throw up a new tracks. Either they go one of two ways. They either throw up an anomaly in the result and they produce something spectacular, or they actually are more likely to have a race which resorts to type. But I think he'll win in Abu Dhabi. So I'll say Las Vegas. So that would put his streak at 16 in a row. Okay, let's go Las Vegas.
Higher or lower, Tristan? Tristan, for you.
I'm going to go with Australia. And that's the third race of next year.
Oh, blimey.
So I'm going to say his streak will have ended after winning the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. So that would be 20, and then he fails to win this 21st Grand Prix. I cannot see Max being beaten by Checo, and I think Checo is the only one who can beat Max because he's in the equal machinery of that incredible Red Bull. So I don't think anyone else is going to be able to catch up this year. And then I'm going to say that he wins the first opening 2 races and then loses in Australia.
Now, that's an interesting statement because, of course, you're insinuating that Red Bull will be as untouchable next year as they are this year. Am I correct?
I'm suggesting... Okay, so I think what's going to happen is everyone will have almost caught up by Red Bull at the end of this year, but they still have an advantage because they got the early lead. Their penalty is going to really bite as we get to the latter half of this year. And we know that Australia is the typical first upgrade track for... Well, I say Australia, it's not. It's the third or fourth one in is when you start getting these upgrades, okay? And so I think going into the beginning of next year, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, I think Red Bull is going to have developed the car a little bit over the winter period because, as we know, they can still do that. They're just going to be a little bit behind on how far they can develop it. And then by the time everyone else's upgrade packages come in Australia next year, then other people will have overtaken the Red Bull. So I think they'll get an ever so slight, very small lead in the beginning of next year until everyone else catches up.
Quite the theory.
There you go. So we'll see how that pans out. We've only got to wait till the 22nd of March next year to find out if I'm correct.
Well, I'll mark that on my calendar and we'll see what comes.
I was going to say there's one thing which we haven't considered yet, and because I thought it was going to get announced this weekend, but the announcement of if any teams have broken the cost cap from last year. Because, of course, this time last year we found out that Red Bull had broken the cost cap from 2021. So if it gets announced they've broken it again, who knows, could throw a spanner in the works.
I don't think they'll have broken it again. I think they learned their lesson last time.
Maybe.
What lesson is that again?
Don't overspend on lunch.
Yeah, or you'll win everything next year.
Yeah, you'll be well fed and winning, and then where will you be?
Strife, am I right, folks? And talking about strife for one F1 driver this season who's been here for a handful of races but now has to bow out for the short term, at least Daniel Ricciardo. AlphaTauri once again had to change their driver lineup owing to Daniel Ricciardo breaking his hand while crashing, after crashing rather, in free practice 2. It meant that the off-mentioned, at least in terms of F1 in review, Liam Lawson was parachuted in. He qualified in P19 and finished in P13. And we understand he'll have another go in F1 next week at Monza owing to Ricciardo's aforementioned injuries. Our thoughts on his weekend then?
Yeah, he did well. He did well, I thought, considering the circumstances that he came into, which were finding out on Friday evening that he was going to be racing this weekend. Once again, a case of good job he was there at the track, because otherwise Red Bull or AlphaTauri, would have been a bit more stuck to find someone. So it was a good job he was there anyway, on duty, on standby, which is what reserve drivers are for sometimes. But yeah, I thought he acquitted himself quite well. I think that it was a case of get through the weekend realistically because of the fact that there was wet conditions for practice for most of qualifying and also for parts of the race. And that's probably some of the most difficult conditions you'd be having in terms of your first F1 race, especially if it's on a tight, twisty track such as Zandvoort. I don't even know if he'd driven... I'm presuming he drove Zandvoort as part of F2 last year because I'm pretty sure they go there. But yeah, I thought he acquitted himself well. He was going to be quite far off in qualifying realistically. And in the end, he ended up 1.7 seconds off Tsunoda in Q1, but that was in wet conditions, so it's not really much to measure by. For people hoping that he'd have a Nick De Vries-sized impact, who, as we remind ourselves, De Vries outclassed Nicholas Latifi on F1 debut last year after having the same amount of time that Liam Lawson did, you'd be disappointed because it didn't happen. But he did, by virtue of a penalty for Tsunoda. He finished ahead of Tsunoda in the classification on race day, which was respectable. Actually, in the end, he finished ahead of Bottas, Tsunoda, Magnussen and Russell. And I do recall, having looked at the order on that last restart, he was in last place, I think. But then I remember looking up at the timing screen, and he had overtaken Magnussen or Bottas, which clearly he overtook both. So put a couple of moves on towards the end of the race. However, it did end his streak, which, I mean, this streak was inevitably going to be ended. But the fun fact, he has the unusual record of he's won on, they were saying this on Sky over the weekend, he's won on debut in 8 different series. So that's the first race he's ridden. So whether that's like he won his first race in F2, he won his first race in Formula Renault, his first race in karts, he's won his first race in and there's another one like DTM, the German touring cars. He's won his first race in a new series on 8 different occasions, which that streak is broken, sadly. It was always going to be this weekend, realistically. But he's based on that stat alone, he's probably got quite a bit of potential, and he put up a respectable job this weekend. Will we see? Well, we'll see him in Italy, won't we? It's been confirmed.
We will.
He's definitely back for Monza, because that's just next weekend, and Daniel Ricciardo's broken metacarpal, needs time to recover. Possibly back for Singapore, because that's still 3 weeks away, and Ricciardo sure might be back, but that's a pretty tough race to come back in with a broken hand or a recovering broken hand. So this won't be the last we see of Liam Lawson, and it's a nice little insight into his driving. I thought he acquitted himself quite well, really.
I think he drove fantastically, and we were saying that if he beats anybody in the race, then he will have done fantastically. And yeah, okay, he qualified last and a little bit behind the pace, but I think we can all forgive him for that. But fundamentally, he managed to survive the hardest race, I think, of the whole season, and probably the most dramatic race in terms of weather I can think of since... what was more dramatic, do you think? 2021... German Grand Prix. Do you remember the one where Mercedes got dressed up and then completely flummoxed that weekend? Or Russia? It was also 2021, I think. Those, or maybe Turkey 2021. Oh, all great races. But, definitely very, very dramatic since one of those 3, depending which one you think is the most dramatic in terms of weather and slipperiness. He managed to finish in 13th place. Brilliant. Absolutely fantastic job for him, and his move on Max Verstappen to unlap himself was pretty ballsy. He took advantage of the sloped track, dumped the car in where he needed to, and then got him on the straight. And then he was a little bit slower than Max, so blue flags came up and he got overtaken. But how many people can you think of that have successfully unlap themselves against Max Verstappen?
I can't think of
more
than...
No. No. So Liam Lawson managed to do that very merry thing on the track in slippery conditions. So I think we can tip our hats to the driver there from New Zealand, and suggest that next week many more eyes will be upon him, because Daniel Ricciardo, I don't think is going to be back for a little bit longer, because he's had an operation now on his wrist and he's got metal work in there. So Singapore is notoriously hot, humid. It's a track that requires full concentration and is very extreme on the body. I don't necessarily think Ricciardo will be back in fit and fighting form. So this could be 3 races perhaps for Liam Lawson. So if he can keep it up and beat Yuki Tsunoda, then I know we were all saying, will Ricciardo beat Tsunoda, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. Will Lawson beat Tsunoda and Ricciardo? Yeah. Who knows? Absolutely brilliant. He really was my driver of the weekend, and I'm a little bit sad he didn't get it, because to get that AlphaTauri into 13th place, I think was very, very good. He kept his cool and didn't throw the car off the track like many other very experienced drivers did this weekend. So, yeah, I think he can be incredibly proud of himself. And whilst he didn't necessarily win on his debut, he did achieve a lot. And I just hope that it doesn't go the way it went for Nick de Vries when, if you remember, he debuted for Williams, got points in his first ever F1 race, and then subsequently got ejected out of the sport. So hopefully he has better luck than Nick de Vries there. But certainly, I think that he's going to have, should we say he's got one foot in the door now to a proper seat in Formula One?
I'd say so. I think he had a near perfect debut when you consider the conditions and circumstances of it, really. Being called up on Friday, first time driving an F1 car outside of a simulator, got through some awful conditions, tick. Beat his teammate, tick. Going to have 2, 3, maybe even 4 chances in an F1 weekend, tick. Really, I do feel sorry for the fact that he's come in now when perhaps teams have penciled in who they want to indeed sign them on in the future. If it had been, let's say, a few weeks before the summer break or a week before that, that may have perhaps put a real spanner in the works for this season coming up. But looking at the, I suppose, lack of opportunities currently, I think it's unfortunately unlikely he'll get on this season, but perhaps the season after that, people will go, well, you better go and back up your ideas, Tsunoda or whoever, because Liam Lawson is in the background, or indeed someone outside of Red Bull's academy. They could go, well, we could get Lawson and do a Nick de Vries. But I think that in terms of de Vries, some will go and say, oh, well, that was the perfect debut, wasn't it? Look at him, got some points in his debut, and he just scuttled off and said, that's me done. But compare that to what's to come, where you've got 2 to 3 races, maybe even 4. I think that's a better test sample, really, for Liam Lawson's future, his quality, his potential, his durability, his stamina, and all these sort of good things you need, really, because it was always going to be very, very difficult for Nick de Vries to go and hit the heights of that P7 finish with Williams again and again. But looking forward, you can perhaps go and see that if Lawson's able to go and replicate this, be that beating his teammate or getting near the top 10, that could put him in good stead in the longer term, rather than a sort of, I suppose, wildcard choice of somebody.
Yeah, the grid's very packed these days, isn't it? And there's lots of talent already there. And for there to be a chance for you to get a seat on there, you need to pick your right moment and you need to seize your chance. So it's probably at the point where teams have already penciled in their drivers for next year. So he's going to have to make the most of this little mini audition that he has, because the competition to get onto the grid is fierce and there aren't too many seats knocking around, especially ones like when you get ones like Haas being renewed with Hülkenberg and Magnussen as they were last week. That's another seat or 2 gone. So Lawson will have to make the most of this chance and see if he can add to his appearances as just the 10th Kiwi, the 10th New Zealander to ever drive a Formula One race.
As a tidbit of knowledge for you, though, if you are familiar with the FIA F1 rulebook, you'll know that you can only have 4 drivers nominated for a team in a single season. And AlphaTauri are in the unlucky, prestigious, I don't know, one of the two, unlucky / prestigious position to have named all their 4 drivers for this season. So they've got Yuki Tsunoda, you've got Nick de Vries, you've got Liam Lawson, and then you've got Daniel Ricciardo. If Daniel Ricciardo is unwell and cannot get back into the car, and Liam Lawson is called back to his has to miss a weekend for whatever reason, but also he is doing Super Formula at the moment, and there is a race in October. Let's imagine, for example, that Ricciardo is out for the rest of the season. Then AlphaTauri would have no other choice but to call back Nick de Vries. They would have no one else. So let's hope Liam is able to stick around for as long as they need whilst Daniel Ricciardo is out. Because if Daniel Ricciardo is out for the rest of the season, and that is not the chance, because it can take 12 weeks or 14 weeks, 16 weeks to repair a broken arm. Trust me, I've broken my arm twice. It takes months. Then they would have no other choice if Liam had to go off and do Super Formula but to call back Nick de Vries, their hero and saviour.
What a turnaround that would be.
I think he'll be back quite soon, though. We see F1 drivers do tend to come back from injuries in like freakish amounts of time. Remember Lance Stroll breaking both his wrists 2 weeks before the season, and then he was back like nothing happened, because he didn't want to miss out on the pace of the car. So it wouldn't surprise me to see Ricciardo back for Singapore, just because they have this determination, this ridiculous fitness and recovery as well. So it wouldn't surprise me to see him back quite soon.
Yeah, and all it cost him was, his dignity and excruciating pain. Do you remember watching Stroll going around like clutching his wrist?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I find that amusing that Lance Stroll was worried about missing the pace on the car. I think the car, to some extent, was missing the pace of Lance Stroll.
And there's other winners, of course, aside from Mr. Lawson and Verstappen that we've mentioned. I suppose the main three would be Alonso, who finished in P2, Gasly, who finished in P3, and Albon, who finished in P8, to name a few. Here's a little game for you, I guess. Who's the biggest winner of all those? Because you got Williams getting themselves a P7 in the Constructors, or solidifying that rather. 2 drivers in quali. Sargent being hampered by technical issues. You got Alpine, for example, who've hit back after criticism. Double points, of course, because Ocon finished in P10. And then last but not least, Aston Martin hitting back against criticism from me above all else, solidifying their place in P3. And Alonso gunning for a win. That was by no means out of the realms of possibility, but if you were to caveat that, Stroll struggling again. So who's the biggest winner, do you reckon, out of those three?
Alpine was the biggest winner in Gasly, because that was a massive win for a team that I think has had a lot of turmoil this season, and they are now the third team to get both drivers on the podium this season,
after Red Bull and Mercedes.
Yes, that's correct. Yes,
high clade, isn't it? Really? Yeah, agreed.
I'm going to concur and say Alpine. I was thinking, out of those three, who's had the biggest sort of net win from that? And arguably, I mean, Williams scoring 25% of their points in this one race. That's a pretty big win, and those points could come very much in handy at the end of the season, especially when early in the race, when you had Zhou in second, it looked like Alfa Romeo could be on for a huge haul, and then that didn't happen, and he had that unfortunate accident towards the end of the race. But yeah, I think that, to be honest, I think Williams could have got more, because Albon Williams messed up the pit stops both times. The first pit stop, though, part of that gaggle of cars who went round for a third lap in pouring rain, led by Lando Norris and his radio call of "Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I'll keep going," which I hate to disagree with, because I'm not a professional racing driver who knows what it's like to drive in those conditions. But I think he might have been wrong. And the second time, Albon stayed out for an extra lap, and that cost him track position, didn't it, to Norris and Hamilton, which he may have lost regardless. But it didn't work out too well for him. Or was it Russell? He lost track position to a Mercedes, definitely. But I'm going to go with Gasly and Alpine in a weekend where they qualified 12th and 16th to come through. Ocon was looking good for some good points. He ended up 10th, but I think Gasly just drove a brilliant race. He was in the right positions. He timed the pit stops well. Got a little bit lucky because his 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane was in the end cancelled out by the one for Perez. So a nice sort of come round, which meant that Gasly was able to get on the podium. His first podium since Baku 2 years ago, when he was there with AlphaTauri, and a much needed result for Alpine after what's been sarcastically a quiet few weeks. They needed a result like that, so they got one. And yeah, I think Gasly, he drove very well as well. I think he's had just on topic of him, he's had a decent start to his Alpine career. He's been quite solid. I think Ocon's been the better driver out of the two, but Gasly's had a decent result. He got third in that sprint in Belgium before the summer break, and now he's got an actual podium in this race. So I think Gasly would be the main winner out of that gaggle that you mentioned.
Interesting, because for me it's got to be Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin, because it ends a cooler streak, if you will, in terms of points. You have to go all the way back to Canada for the last time that a Aston Martin car, indeed Fernando Alonso, was on the podium. And I think that they've really hit back after a summer break where many questions were over them in terms of what they could do, whether they'd fall down. You had us, for example, saying, well, it's not impossible for them to be down in P5 of the constructors when they currently sit in P3, as is, or what could be, should I say, rather the fall that they could suffer from. So I think this is a statement of intent, really. I don't think that you're ever going to see a situation where both Aston Martin cars are gunning for, let's say, P2 and 3 or P2 and 4, but to go and get that and really be causing Verstappen some problems, being the only one doing that in this Grand Prix weekend in testing conditions, I think is to their betterment, really. So they've stuck it to Ferrari, in my view, and shown that they are willing, indeed, egging themselves on to go and keep that P3 until the bitter end. So it's heating up the fight. So that would be the only reason I'd say they're better than Alpine, insofar as when you look at what it means for them and the constructors, they're in a healthy position. It remains healthy. Meanwhile, unfortunately, Alpine have been hampered by earlier mistakes, retirements and misfortune, really. But if we're looking at it alone, then fair enough, really, to Alpine. They're doing very well today.
Surely the biggest loser out of everyone was George Russell, who came on the radio and said, I was forecast for a podium. Forecast. How can you... forecast for a podium. They had the air of, my father will hear about this. About it. It's not very good. And he had an awful race. Mercedes got it completely wrong with George Russell, because he was, as he rightly says, starting out in podium positions, and the expectation was that Mercedes would do what they do best and what they've done very well for years, and pit drivers at the right time. And when the rain started coming down, I don't know about you, but I saw the fact that Williams wasn't pitting, Mercedes wasn't pitting, and McLaren wasn't pitting. I was thinking, no, not again, McLaren, not again. No, why? But they didn't pit, and they just kept George out, and they said, oh, George, no, don't worry, we'll ride it out, as he was losing 20, 30 seconds a lap to everybody else. Oh, what an embarrassing moment, really, for poor George. And then that was it. After that, it was see where they could get to. I mean, Toto Wolff called it catastrophic in terms of race strategy. So I don't think they'll be very pleased with the results. And I mean, I can understand George's frustration, and I think it's funny to joke about it because, of course, we weren't there racing a forecast for a podium. And I think what George was trying to say was, look, guys, we were in the podium positions. We should still have been in the podium positions. We had the pace of the podium positions. How on earth am I now in 17th place? And I think that's a fair question to ask. But it's just funny the way he actually came onto the radio and was like, I was forecast for a podium, guys. Which was not great. And unfortunately, he didn't help himself. He had a collision at the end and a puncture, which means he had to pit 7 times. Which, in fairness, Max Verstappen pitted 6 times. I think there was a bit of a debate on whether or not Max Verstappen now holds the accolade for the most number of pit stops to then win a race, because he has 6. Someone was going to have to go count Canada, I think, to see if whether or not Jenson Button had more stops. But he didn't help himself. Unfortunately, he was in the collision at the end. He had to pit again, and he came basically last. Not brilliant for poor George. So I think, Tom, in answer to your question about biggest losers, I think hands down it has to be George Russell. I think to go from opportunity for second place to last is pretty poor. That's a big L, isn't it, really?
He said he was forecast for a podium. Maybe he was just making a nod with his wording to the weather, the weather forecast.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I think he's just a very well educated man. That's all. But I'd agree in terms of Mercedes had a stinker. they had a very fast car, as shown by Hamilton and Russell charging their way through the field. Hamilton especially, I thought, was particularly quick. But yeah, they had a stinker. I doubt when they say that they could have been on Verstappen's pace, I'm not so sure about that. But I think we take the mick, but I think they may well have been forecast for a podium had they got the call right. So definitely one of the losers there. I would say that if you look at someone like Guan Yu Zhou, he was in second place, and the fact that he fell down the field, yes, the car was slow and he wasn't realistically going to stay that high up, but can we call him a loser from the race because of that? Or do you think he's a bit blameless for his car just sticking him down in 12th before he crashed?
I think we can to a point, because it's once again an opportunity that he's not really converted. We're seeing flashes of him being a solid driver that can get you exactly 2 points on 2 occasions this season, but in many ways you make your own luck, don't you? And at one point you've got to go and make that luck stick, and you've got to go and convert it for you then to go on to bigger and better things. No disrespect to Alfa Romeo. It's almost like the Hulkenberg conundrum. Everyone goes, oh, he's such a good driver, he's done so well. He's just been unlucky a few times. Just been a bit unlucky when he's been in a podium position exactly every time he's been P3 or P2 or P4 or P1. So I'm starting to, not to rehash our old discussion from last week, I'm starting to ultimately think that Zhou isn't all he's meant to be cracked up to be, unfortunately. I think he's someone who brings a lot of money in, but perhaps he doesn't bring too much talent in. But he was a bit unlucky this Grand Prix, I'll give you. Interesting. What do you make about Haas having a poor performance? Can they be defined as losers? You've got P16 for Mr. Magnussen. You've got P12 for Nico Hulkenberg, just after they've both been announced to the driver lineup for next season. Not the worst display, but yet again, another display where there's no points and no hope of points, really.
Haas weren't really there this weekend, actually, were they? And I think that was unfortunate, but it wasn't a bad result for them, as you say. I mean, they were P12 and P16. I just don't think the track suited the Haas car. I think it was a high-speed track, as we know, and the performance from Williams meant that they were naturally ahead anyway. So when you had other drivers pushing forwards, then Haas was always going to fall outside the points. I think Haas will be looking forward to the upcoming races in places like Singapore or America, and to consider how they're going to claw back the points when the Williams starts getting a little bit weaker. I don't expect Williams to do very well in Singapore, so I expect Haas to try and be bringing back some more points there. And a P12 is a perfectly respectable place, given who's in front of him when you look at the overall results. So I don't necessarily think this was Haas's opportunity to win. And this is part of the reason why, when we're talking about Logan Sargent's miserable ending in his DNF, why he perhaps it should also be added listed as the biggest loser, because he had everything to gain for Williams, and unfortunately left Williams only taking in half points because they have only one driver, whereas Haas had, were only two cars away from a point, which makes a bit of a difference. So I think that's what we can say about Haas this weekend, which is this wasn't their track. And the fact that they had both drivers finish the race puts them in good stead, because when it comes to later on in the season, when they start entering back into the tracks where we think Haas will do quite well at, they have a slightly better opportunity to take as many points as they can. So I know I would say that they should feel, pretty okay with this race weekend. It was never going to be spectacular. And if anything, their rivals, Williams, had a bad weekend because only Albon was able to successfully convert excellent pace and qualifying into results.
Can I introduce another loser, because I'm desperate to talk about the fact that he might be going to professional tennis allegedly. Mr. Stroll, who has just once again just had a poor weekend. 11th place when his teammate is on the podium. He now has 47 points to Alonso's 168, which is a yawning chasm, I think would be one way to describe it. I'm doing a little calculation here, just looking at in the last 6 races. If we ignore the sprint on the main Grand Prix, he has got 7 points in the last 6 races. In this, I'm trying to compare the fact that the Aston Martin, when it's had its downturn in pace. So in the last 6 races, he's got 7 points. In that same time, Alonso has received, I make it 65 points in those 6 races where the car has been on a downturn. He just, I don't know. He's just, in a week where the US Open tennis has started, maybe he'd be better suited being at that event than at the Zandvoort Grand Prix or being at Monza this weekend, because he's just, once again, just absolutely nowhere. He's just not with it. I'm sorry. He's just, this man is a Formula One driver. I can't believe it. It's just so off the pace, and perhaps, I don't know whether his wrist injuries are still causing him trouble this later on in the year, but he's just, he's being absolutely destroyed by a 42-year-old. Let's be real here.
And the interesting one about this, when you compare it to someone like Ricciardo, because let's say you have one driver doing very well, Norris, when he was with Ricciardo, was performing or doing far better than he was, and you could go and say that, well, Alonso's doing the same to Lance Stroll, but Stroll's got 2 P6 finishes to his name, a P4 finish, a P7 finish in a car that's finished there on multiple occasions, with Alonso being the driver of it. So it's not like he's on a downward trajectory as such. It's very much more the fact, in my view, that he can peak at a lower peak than Alonso can, but his dips, if you will, his busts are far more prevalent, obvious and consistent, really. So that must be the most frustrating thing, I think, if you're his dad, Lawrence Stroll, if you're somebody involved in the Aston Martin family, the company of Aston Martin, because the potential and the quality is there. Look at him during the wet Grand Prix, for example, wet qualifying, starts as well, he's always quite good there, but when it comes to converting it consistently, which is what it's all about really, just fails to do so. And that's ultimately how you judge your team, how you judge your driver, how Aston Martin will be judged as a conglomerate, as a constructor, and also how their individual drivers will be judged. So in my view, I think he's got to do something not too dissimilar to what Perez needs to do, insofar as be consistently good and be consistently at your best what you can achieve, instead of flattering to deceive in 1 or 2 races and then deceiving in others, if you will. So that would be my message, or my target for him, if I could tell him so. And with that note of caution, indeed advice to Lance Stroll, thank you very much for listening all the way to the end of episode 26 of F1 in Review 2023. Be that on your preferred podcast provider or indeed elsewhere, a reminder as ever, you can follow us and indeed watch short snippets of this episode to come, and then indeed the ones before that on Twitter, X and TikTok as well. And as we may have mentioned once or twice, F1 is back in a more permanent fashion now. Monza is next on the calendar, that coming this weekend. If you're watching, listening or indeed observing this one in the UK, British summertime, that will be a 3 p.m. start on the Saturday for qualifying, and then a 2 p.m. start on the Sunday for the race, where we're told there may be some rain, maybe not biblical rain, but like we saw in Zandvoort, but rain nonetheless we can but hope, in terms of an interesting race and perhaps somebody else winning. But thank you very much for listening all the way to the end of this episode. We will be back next week and we'll be able to go and tell you all the good things, bad things and things in between about what happened at Monza. Thank you very much and we'll see you next week.